From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I want to check in on the markets. Joining us is Abigail Doolittle. And the markets I really want to know about, Abigail, but I got to tell you, most of us are watching this Doordash because it's pretty extraordinary. They priced it at 102. It's been going up about $1 a minute now. It's up to like 190 to 195, although it hasn't started trading yet.
Yeah, it's really pretty amazing, David. Doordash is this blockbuster IPO that we are waiting for it to go public, but there's so much demand that it has gone from 102, what it was priced at, and that's above its initial range, or actually a second range of $90 to $95, that it just keeps going higher. And the indication that I last saw was also 190 to 195. So they're really eking up this demand. So a bigger question is this IPO frenzy, is it too far, too fast? We don't know the answer to that yet, but DoorDash certainly has a very solid business, being the biggest delivery business, food delivery business here in the U.S. About 50% of the market is captured. So once it does start trading, we will certainly be bringing that to you. So exciting. December right now set to be a record IPO month because, of course, tomorrow Airbnb will be going public, will be trading publicly. So exciting stuff, David. As for the markets overall in a broader perspective, not as exciting. We have very small moves. We did have record highs earlier for the S&P 500, now down ever so slightly, down by about 0.1%. Interestingly, we have a little bit of sell the news on Pfizer, David. Earlier, the stock had been down 3.3%, now down less than 1% on the news that the vaccine should not be used for some folks who have allergies. So just a little bit of a negative reaction stock-wise for Pfizer around that, even ahead of the expectation that the FDA will be granting emergency authorization tomorrow. Moderna had also been trading slightly lower in sympathy. On the other hand, you have this tug of war still between the cyclicals. We have energy slightly higher, tech slightly lower. And then when we take a look at bonds, David, today is the first day this week that we actually have bonds trading off a little bit, yields up as bonds pull back just a little bit. But on the week, there is a rally for bonds. So that speaks to the overall uncertainty that we talk about so often around stimulus and, of course, the virus.
Yeah, the 10-year eking its way up back toward 1, perhaps. So, Abigail, I was actually going to ask you about that rotation because we're going to have a guest on in just a moment on that subject. And the question I really have is it tech going up and the cyclicals is cyclicals going up and tech going down, or is it just the cyclicals going up? Because I'm not sure people are really selling out of tech.
You are right. It's a really great question because the rally right now is just right. Earlier this year, in September, if you recall, there was a pretty big pullback for technology. And the reason that it hurts when those tech names sell off, they have such big weightings to the indexes that if they pull back, even for the right reasons that money is going into the cyclical sectors, such as energy and financials and industrials, it weighs on the markets. Whereas right now you have money going into energy and financials and industrials, but not really big selling out of the Apples and the Amazons and the Facebooks of the world. So you could make the case that it is just right. Perhaps we'll continue to see what feels like a slow melt up higher. December seasonally is very good for stocks, and many experts are saying that we could in fact see the Santa Claus rally, which is a nice gain at the end of this month. So something to wait and see whether or not it happens.
And that would come on top of a November, which was pretty blockbuster in itself. Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. Well, most of the attention today is focused on that blockbuster Doordash IPO. And as Abigail said, we'll bring you that as soon as it starts trading. That's one of the companies that people turned to when the pandemic shut down a good part of the U.S. economy. But growing vaccine hopes have investors also taking another look at other stocks that were hurt by the pandemic rather than helped, raising the specter of a possible rotation back into some of those value stocks. For his perspective, we welcome now Kevin Holt. He's Invesco Chief Investment Officer of U.S. Value Equities. Great to have you here, Kevin. So give us your best sense of whether there really is a rotation going back into value.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the last 2 to 3 months in the market, we have had a rotation back into value. And if you take a step back to when COVID really kind of reared its head in January and February, earnings revisions for energy companies, for travel companies, and for banks, those are the primary areas of the market that were hit by this downturn, whereas the beneficiaries were more the technology companies who have really enabled us to work from home and deal with this pandemic. But as we move forward, we think the earnings revisions, you're already seeing it for the banks because credit losses haven't come in where people expected, so they're starting to release earnings. And we think over the next 12 months, the bank earnings, the energy, the travel, the pent-up demand, once the vaccine is kind of widely disseminated, you're going to see major earnings revisions, and those stocks which are more traditional value stocks, are very inexpensive at this point.
So, Kevin, the question I just asked Abigail, I'll ask you as well. Is it a true rotation in that people are coming out of tech and going into cyclicals, or is it actually just a rising tide lifting all boats? And I suppose that tide would be vaccine.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think it's a little bit of both, because you have to think, what more could happen for these technology companies to, pull forward demand. And I think most of us agree we pulled forward demand in a trend that was going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years. But we probably front loaded a lot of that demand. So I think the market sees the relative, year-over-year earnings power probably slowing for that sector, and they see it increasing for these other areas. So although these tech businesses are fantastic businesses, and frankly, if they pull back, 20, 30, 40%, I think we would find those attractive. But at this point, I think everything is priced in. And with the cyclicals or the banks and with travel, very little to nothing is priced in. And I think there's a lot of pent-up demand out there.
So there are two other things that we're following every day. One is the possibility of further stimulus coming out of the United States Congress. And the other is actually the change in the administration going over to President-elect Biden. How might those affect stocks, and particularly not stocks overall, but some sectors particularly?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest single issue we're probably all looking for is the Senate races in Georgia at this point, to see where they end up. Obviously, if the Democrats were to win both of those seats, taxes would go up. That would be probably a large negative, particularly for the technology companies, which are big taxpayers, but for banks and a number of other U.S. industries. With that said, I do think another fiscal package is coming down the way, and the government's really done a good job so far. I think once we get another fiscal package, and people have talked about, we haven't talked about in a long time, inflation. But with fiscal stimulus and the monetary stimulus that have been pumped into the system over the last 12 months, that has really caused some expectations that inflation could come, the back end of the curve could come. So there are some puts and takes in the Biden administration that may be tough on energy, but we think energy investment has gone down, which is going to create upward prices as supply demand comes back into balance. So that'll be positive. Again, the bank earnings could be slightly tougher regulations on the banks, but we think they've proven through this cycle that they have enough capital, and that the regulations that were put in place after the last financial crisis have caused really fortress balance sheets in this financial, the banks we've created to thrive in this environment. So we're very, very constructive on these areas. We think, if likely that the Republicans will win 1 to 2 seats, and if that's the case, no tax increases, slightly more fiscal stimulus, which we think, frankly, will be a very good backdrop for 2021.
Kevin, come back to that inflation point, because we haven't seen inflation since I don't know when, and people keep talking about maybe it could come back. Is it a significant enough prospect right now that investors should be starting to take it into account?
I think you have to think about it because, as you said, we haven't seen it, frankly, throughout most of my career, and I started in the 80s. So we've been on a downward trajectory for interest rates for an extended period of time. But when you get to zero, there's really no place to go. The U.S. Federal Reserve has said they do not want to go negative. So, and then if you start to think about, what could get you moving in another direction, we've had monetary stimulus. This fiscal stimulus is what's new. So I do think you have to think that the back end of the curve, as the Fed, as the government tries to get growth moving, there is a better chance than we've seen in a long time that inflation could tick up, which would be positive for economic growth and for these cyclical stocks that we talked about.
And does healthcare just work no matter what happens, essentially?
Yeah, I mean that is a tough one with the administration because no matter who won the presidential election, pharmaceutical pricing is first and foremost on both parties' agendas. So I think you have to be a little bit careful with the pharmaceuticals at this point. I do think the healthcare service, it's unlikely that the Democrats could get enough to overturn and go to a single payer system. So we think the HMOs, we think the hospitals. I mean, the hospitals really were hit pretty hard during the pandemic as a lot of elective procedures were deferred, so the profitability was hurt. Those elective procedures will come back over the next 1 to 2 years. So we think the hospitals are in good shape. We think the health insurers are in good shape. We're a little more reluctant on pharmaceuticals because pricing seems to be kind of a bullseye on their back at this point.
Okay, Kevin, really great to have you with us today. That's Kevin Holt. He's CIO of U.S. Value Equities at Invesco. Coming up here is President-elect Biden delivering on his promise to make his leadership team look like America. We asked Basil Smikle. He's professor of public affairs at Rutgers Newark University. Plus, we're waiting for Doordash to start trading. The company is now indicated to open at $195 to $200 a share. As I say, it's going up about $1 a minute as far as I can tell. The IPO was originally priced at $102. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. President Trump is promising to intervene in Texas's long-shot attempt to have the U.S. Supreme Court block election results from 4 states. Mr. Trump calls this case the big one, but legal experts say there's virtually no chance that justices will agree to hear it. And yet another blow for President Trump's efforts to overturn his election loss. Nevada Supreme Court has rejected the president's appeal to reverse the state's results, which affirmed President-elect Joe Biden as the winner in the battleground state. The court says there was no evidence supporting Mr. Trump's claims of fraud and wrongdoing. Mr. Biden won Nevada by more than 33,000 votes. Boris Johnson says no British Prime Minister could accept the European Union's Brexit demands. He heads to Brussels today for a showdown with European Commission head Ursula von der Leyen. Prime Minister Johnson's team is hoping the face-to-face talks with the EU will give a boost to the deadlocked process. Both sides are still hoping to reach an agreement before the end of December, when the Brexit transition period expires. Iran says U.S. sanctions are making it hard for the country to get COVID-19 vaccines. The Trump administration says medicines and humanitarian goods are exempt from sanctions, but restrictions on trade have made many banks and companies across the world hesitant to do business with Iran, fearing punitive measures from Washington. The country's also cut off from the international banking system, making it difficult to transfer payments. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. President-elect Biden promised that his leadership team would reflect America. Well, he's well into picking that team, so how is he doing so far? For an initial report, we welcome back now to Bloomberg Basil Smikle. He's Democratic strategist and professor of public affairs at Rutgers Newark University. Welcome back, Basil. It's really great to have you. So give us your sense about how he's doing. He's promised to have a diverse cabinet and other leadership team. It seems pretty diverse to me.
It is, and it's becoming more and more diverse with every choice. And so it is, I think it is, as you teed up, it is reflective of both the country and that coalition that got him elected. Look, there are going to be some concerns. We've already heard, some progressives that may have had some concerns about picks, particularly Chief of Staff Dick Emanuel. There are some other concerns about this most recent appointment or nomination of General Austin to be a defense secretary, really over the concern of the waiver so close to his active duty service. But, there are 2 things that Biden talked a lot about in the campaign. 1, having, an administration that is diverse and reflective of the country, and 2, being able to start the job on day 1. And with so much going on in our country right now, questions over both the virus and the vaccine rollout, this cabinet looks like a group of leaders who have a tremendous experience in government and can start their job on day 1 as soon as he's inaugurated.
Basil, when we talk about diversity, we have a tendency to think automatically about race and ethnicity and gender. There's a lot of other kinds of diversity as well in people's backgrounds and, frankly, in their political point of view. Is this cabinet, does it have enough of progressive representation in it?
I don't know that many progressives would. They may not be as happy as in terms of those number of picks. I can say, and as I mentioned earlier, that they have raised concerns over some of these picks that they weren't progressive enough, particularly the folks that are closest to the president. But I would say let's wait and see. I can't imagine that the Biden team is would be unresponsive to the kind of support that they got from young voters and from progressive voters on the path to getting elected. And certainly with what would happen and reflecting that sort of progressive politics in Congress and what we'll see, I guess, perhaps in the next session, that he's going to have some of those voices in the White House. So my message to them would be, let's wait and see. I'm hopeful that he will make appointments that would appeal to progressives in the country and certainly in the House. And I would also say that, as much as we talk about diversity, as you said, there's race, ethnicity, there's progressive, moderate, maybe conservative, but also class. Folks that are representative of rural communities across the country that largely didn't vote for Biden, but those are the kinds of voters that we need to be representative as well.
When it comes to the cabinet and other appointees that have Senate confirmation required, it's not enough to pick them. You have to get them through the Senate. What are the prospects of getting some resistance out of this Senate for some of these picks?
You'll get resistance, at least in the Twitterverse and perhaps in the media. There's generally been this courtesy of allowing presidents to get their nominees through in terms of the cabinet positions. Judges are certainly a completely different story, but there's this courtesy that the Senate would allow presidents to have their nominees. But I would imagine that in teeing up the midterm elections, that you would see Republicans, particularly in the Senate, start to sort of set their markers now with language and rhetoric that they'll be using for the next couple of years. So again, I think there may be some backlash, there'll be some conversation, but I imagine that the president will get his picks, and I think they would be a detriment to Republicans to hold anything up, because holding up a nominee could potentially mean holding up stimulus, holding up relief during a pandemic, and that's something they don't want to be tagged with.
We don't yet know who's going to have the majority in the Senate, and therefore not just more votes, but also the chairmanships and things like that. Talk about what we're looking at in Georgia right now with these two runoff elections in this U.S. Senate.
Boy, it really is coming down to the wire, and I think again, going back to sort of what's happening in D.C., you can't extricate that from what's happening in Georgia. I think a lot, if we've looked at the Trump administration's court challenges to voter turnout, to the vote outcomes in specific states, especially in Georgia, you're looking at not just the defeat of those challenges in court, but the infighting that's caused among Republicans in that state. And so that suggests to me that it potentially will tamp down the vote and excitement for those Republican candidates, and Democrats should be able to at least get one victory, hopefully two, in those Senate races, which of course will shift the balance to Democratic control, and I think end the gridlock for a lot of Americans are watching that and quite hopeful for it, particularly in a time that is so crucial for us as we're thinking about and talking about, further stimulus for American households.
And Basil, it strikes me that the Republican candidates, those two incumbent Republican senators from Georgia, are not distancing themselves from President Trump's challenge. In fact, I saw today that they both have now really signed on to, agreed with the Texas State Attorney General, who has filed his own lawsuit, wanting to set aside the results of elections, not in Texas, but in places like Georgia.
Right, and I always go back to the Secretary of State of Georgia, who is a Republican, that very early on said, "Look, I may have not liked the outcome, but I'm not going to sit here and say that the outcome or the election itself was fraudulent." And that's important because remember, Republicans were on the ballot too. So if you're challenging the entire election result and you're challenging the ballots, you're also challenging the Republican victories that may have taken place during that same election. And so you're creating problems for those folks that were running down ballot who still have to govern in their states long after this president is out of office. So it's not just about him, and I think that's what some Republicans are responding to. Like, you've got to think party. You think about the rest of the party, and I think that's the frustration that's causing that kind of internal conflict. But yes, as those incumbents are siding with Donald Trump, the hope is that that coalition that he has and the strength of support he has will help elevate them, but it's also alienating members of their own party.
Okay, Basil, finally, as a Democrat, you must be a little concerned about the fact that there's one person not on that ballot for the runoffs, and that is Donald Trump. Because in that election, November 3rd, it seems people really were inclined to split their ballot.
Yeah. Well, what is encouraging is that we've actually seen a tremendous amount of support and activity in terms of voters engaged even during this period of time when they're actually registering to vote and so on in Georgia. And the truth is, all the work that Stacey Abrams and others have done, not just in this cycle, but between the cycles, which is something that generally doesn't happen, has really laid the groundwork for the support that we've seen for Democrats in Georgia going blue. So as long as that continued from November, I have no reason to believe that it hasn't. That same level of engagement, it actually is encouraging for us.
Okay, Basil, it's always such a treat to have you with us. It's Basil Smikle. He's Democratic strategist and professor of public affairs at Rutgers Newark University. And we're continuing to watch the Doordash. It's not started trading yet. Actually, the indicated price has started to come down a little bit. Went up to 200. It's down to about 188 to 191. Still ahead, SEC Chairman Jay Clayton joins us to talk about what he's accomplished during his tenure and what comes next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We're going to take our eyes off of Doordash IPO just for a moment and go over to Europe. It may all come down to a dinner, as British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is in Brussels for a working dinner with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, in what could be, yet once again, a make-or-break moment for a Brexit deal. For a sense of what this has meant for investors, we turn now to our colleague Amer in London.
Yes, another make or break moment. Who knew there could be so many make or break moments in the telling of one story, David? It could all come down to whether or not Boris and Ursula like the starters, if the chicken's well cooked, if the profiteroles hold up for dessert. I'm joking, David. We don't know what's on the menu, but certainly investors and traders hoping that a trade deal will be on the menu. And there's certainly been some optimism when you look at the markets today. If you look at the pound rising against the dollar and the euro, signaling that investors seem to think that the possibility of a deal is opening them up. They're seeing that this dash across the channel by Boris to meet with Ursula von der Leyen is what could be needed to break the impasse. And that's certainly what's being signaled by the PM's team here, saying that we might be getting a deal. The Europeans hedging a bit more, a bit like what we're seeing in the options market there. The cost of hedging against losses in sterling rising to the highest peak since June, David.
If they get it done, it'll be the profiteroles, without a doubt. It'll be the profiteroles, without a doubt. Thanks so much to Amer over in London. Up next, the battle for the Senate in the state of Georgia, and the key role that Asian Americans could play. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. We are waiting for Doordash to start trading. The entire food delivery company is currently slated to open at $185 to $188 a share. That's well down from the $200 was, but it's well over the $102 it was originally priced at. So we'll bring that as soon as Doordash starts trading. In the meantime, let's turn to Georgia. President-elect Biden won Georgia by only 13,000 votes, and the high turnout among Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders may have made the crucial difference. We welcome now someone who worked hard on that turnout. She is Aisha Yaqub Mahmood. She is Executive Director of the Progressive Asian American Advocacy Fund. So, Aisha, welcome. It's really good to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. Give us a sense, because I didn't understand this until I started reading about this, how many Asian and Pacific Islanders there are in the state of Georgia.
Well, thank you so much for having me. To answer your question, we have nearly 500,000 Asian Americans in Georgia. Only about 300,000 of those, however, are registered to vote. So we have a pretty massive population of Asian American voters, and we're really excited to see the turnout and the difference that they've made in the November election.
And are they concentrated in certain areas of Georgia, like around Atlanta, for example?
Yeah, for sure. We have a massive population of our community members centered in the metro Atlanta area in key counties like Gwinnett, Fulton, DeKalb, Forsyth, and Cobb counties. But we are fairly spread out across the state as well. So most of our work has been centered in these key counties, but we are now reaching out to our statewide population to make sure we can turn them out for the upcoming January runoff.
Well, you had a big push to turn them out for the November 3rd election. And I think you should take a moment to brag on what you got done because it looks like you had some success there. What did you have happen on November 3rd?
Yeah, I mean, on leading up to November 3rd, we had been running a pretty special program, including relational and community organizing, multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-generational organizing to make sure that we could talk about the issues that are important to our Asian American communities. And we did that talking to voters on the phones, via text message, through ethnic media and digital organizing, and really making sure that we were reaching voters in a very authentic way that was true to their language, true to their culture, and really hitting on those issues that they care most about. Now, all of that really led us to seeing more than 185,000 Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders that voted in the November election, and actually a majority of them that had voted during early voting and voting by mail. And so this was over a 62% increase from our voter turnout in 2016, and we're really proud of that. We're proud that our community has increased our voter registration by over 80,000 voters in just the last 4 years. But we're also extremely proud of the very local and state level wins that we had this year. Obviously, it's very exciting to see that Trump lost in Georgia and that Biden won. But we're also more proud of what happened at the local level. We helped to flip county commissions, help flip school board seats, and make sure that we could really make a difference where it hits our voters the most, and that's at the local level.
An impressive set of numbers. How much were you helped by the vice presidential candidate, now Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, who is Black American but also Indian American? As I looked at the numbers, it looked like a fair number of those Asian and Pacific Islanders in Georgia are in fact Indian.
Yeah, I mean, that Indian Americans make up our largest Asian American ethnic group in Georgia. And it's no lie that the presence of Vice President-elect Kamala Harris did help to excite and energize those voters. I will say a lot of them were already really excited about supporting a Democratic ticket, but I think the presence of Kamala Harris on that ticket helped make sure that they were doing more, that they were being louder, and that they were engaging more people to turn out this fall. So I think it was really exciting to see all the young and all of the vast majority of people that were just excited about that ticket, but also making sure that they were spreading that word within their families and their friend groups.
Kamala Harris will not be on the ballot for the runoff elections, the two of them on January 5th. How much more difficult does that make your job?
Well, our work in Georgia has always been around the issues that impact our voters, whether it's local issues, state level issues, or the issues that relate to them at the federal level. We're going to be talking to our voters about healthcare access and voting rights and immigration and education. And those issues are still what we are talking to our voters about today. Whether or not we have a presidential candidate on the ballot, I think our voters are turning out because we're able to talk to them about those issues and convince them that this election is just as important as the one in November, if not more. And I think those conversations are already happening right now. Voters are obviously already inundated with outreach from campaigns and parties and other organizations, but we are able to do that very specific, persuasive messaging with our communities in a way that is more authentic and resonates better with them.
What would be the role of early voting on January 5? And in particular, I saw a report that, in fact, they're closing some of the locations that were used on November 3rd. They will not be open on January 5th. Does that give you some concern?
It definitely gives us concern. As I mentioned before, a vast majority of our population had used early voting and absentee voting leading up to the November election. If I remember those numbers correctly, about 85% of our voters had turned out either early or voted by mail. So when we're looking at the shutting down of early voting locations, when we're looking at things like the Republicans trying to close and outlaw ballot drop boxes, it's definitely a concern for us, but because we know that Republicans and the Conservative Party in the state are trying to make it harder for our communities to vote, harder for our votes to be heard. But they also are scared because they've seen our numbers and they've seen the progress we've made over the last 4 years. So It's not going to stop us from doing the work that we do. We're going to push harder and make sure that if it's not during early voting, that our voters are showing up on election day. But we'll do whatever we can to continue to fight back against this voter suppression. Because to be very honest, it's something we've seen year after year in Georgia, but now it's finally making its way to the national stage.
Aisha, really good to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time. That's Aisha Yaqub Mahmoud. She is Executive Director of the Asian American Advocacy Fund. Coming up, he has led the SEC through the Trump administration. We're joined by SEC Chairman Jay Clayton as he prepares to leave his legacy and what he has left to do. We're still waiting right now for DoorDash's IPO. It's now indicated open at $179 to $182, coming down a bit. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Jay Clayton has been the chairman of the SEC for the better part of 4 years, a tenure that saw a record number of new regulations, more than 65, with some perhaps still to come, and over $14 billion in monetary awards. As he prepares to leave office later this month, we welcome him now back to Bloomberg for a look back and maybe a look forward as well. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for being with us. We're kind of a little bit of the statistics here of what's happened. It strikes me that you'll go down in history as a fairly activist chairman of the SEC. How did that work in an administration that prided itself on deregulation? Or maybe a different way of asking is, how do you decide which are good regulations and which are bad regulations?
Well, David, in this job, you always have to be active because our markets are ever active. If we're not modifying, updating, modernizing, as I like to say, our regulations, we're falling behind. And so you have to be activist. And what we've tried to do is be activists for the benefit of our Main Street investors, really getting Main Street investors better products cheaper, making sure they have better protections. And in the event that our Main Street investors unfortunately fall victim to fraudsters, getting them their money back as quickly as we can. And in addition, trying to modernize our framework around the functioning of markets so that markets function efficiently in a modern age. And you have to be engaged to do those things.
You've put down as one of your principles that really protection of the Main Street investor, as you call them. You also sometimes say long-term Main Street investor. You add that in there. What can the SEC do to address the issue of long-term versus short-term?
It's a terrific question. It's a question not just for the SEC, but across our economy. Look, markets thirst for information. They thirst for information by the microsecond. So markets are always going to be focusing on short-term changes. The culture of investing for the long term is something that we need to foster across our regulatory infrastructure. The SEC is here to help with the way that we try to talk about trends, uncertainties, opportunities, getting companies to disclose that kind of forward-looking information. I think disclosure of that type of forward-looking information helps foster a long-term attitude. But David, one thing I've learned in Washington is that this needs to be sort of a whole of government approach to more long-termism for investing.
One of the goals that you've really had is to make sure that we are forming capital through public markets. And I'm going to interrupt us here just for a moment because DoorDash has just started trading at $182. That's information for you, Mr. Chairman. They just started trading at $182. As you know, it was priced originally at $102. The indication has been bouncing all around. But I want to really come back because it's not just DoorDash. We also have Airbnb sort of on deck, as it were, coming out. Give us a sense of what this really flurry of IPOs, largely in the tech, the growth, the startup space, what they're telling us about our markets here as we approach the end of the year.
Well, look, David, we have focused on increasing the attractiveness of our public capital markets for medium-sized companies and companies, before they get to be astronomically large. And why? Because in our public markets, retail investors and professional investors sit side by side. And if you're investing over the long term, like we talked about, being able to sit side by side with the professionals is such an advantage. Now, whether a market is relatively attractive in 1 month or 1 quarter or 1 year, as opposed to another, that's not something that we can focus on at the SEC. We sort of have to do these things for the long term. But I am heartened to see that over the last 2, 3, 4 years, our public markets do seem to be becoming more attractive sooner in a company's life cycle.
Are you concerned at all about the growth of private capital as opposed to public capital? Because there's an awful lot that's being done on the private side now that used to be done publicly.
Well, let me say this. People talk about that as a dichotomy. It's not a dichotomy. If you're a company that's, say, under, pick a number, David, 100 million, 200 million, the private markets are really your only viable source of growth capital. So we need to preserve that private market and foster that private market. It is part of the dynamism of America. It's part of innovation. Then you get above that $200 million valuation level, you get it up into the types of companies that you were just talking about. There, you do want to encourage those companies to become public companies for the reasons we talked about. Greater participation from the American retail investor. And that's how I look at it, David. But we need vibrant private markets up through and well above that $200 million level. It so contributes to the nimble nature of American capitalism.
As you pursued your goal of really protecting the long-term mainstream investor, one of the things you talked about was, I think you referred to as corporate hygiene. One aspect of which is insider trading. And I have a very specific question because you've had to deal with a COVID pandemic, which none of us ever thought we'd anticipate, and it affects your business as well. Have you seen instances of questions at least being raised about insiders perhaps selling securities in some of the companies that could benefit from vaccine or treatment?
Sure, David. Look, anytime you have a new information environment. And COVID has certainly created a new information environment across many companies, including, most notably pharmaceutical companies. You have the much greater risk that there's an asymmetry of information between a company's insiders and the market more generally. And in those circumstances, companies need to up their game. They need to up their controls to ensure that no one is taking advantage of, or I would say even be perceived to be taking advantage of that kind of information asymmetry. And we've been very vocal about this. Follow your internal procedures. Have your checks with your general counsel's office on whether it's appropriate to be selling stock, and then just ask yourself, does this look right or not? I mean, look, we're going to get through this, I believe. And if you're in it for the long term, I'm not telling people you have to, but think about staying in it for the long term.
Mr. Chairman, I want to look forward here just a little bit on some things that will actually come up after you've left office. And one of them is in the area of ESG. You've spoken out about that quite a few times, environmental, social, and governance, saying they're not all the same sort of thing. You refer to Kenneth Arrow, your favorite economist, in that connection. But I want to talk actually about governance, not the environmental part. There's a proposal now from NASDAQ, basically, to impose some diversity requirements on boards. That's not going to come up in your tenure. But if you were giving some private advice to your successor, would you be inclined to say that's a good idea?
Well, David, look, it would be inappropriate for me to comment on it or to bind in any way my successor. But what I do want to say is this is an area that we have decided at the commission we are focused on this, and we've actually focused on it here at the commission. Diversity, inclusion, and opportunity, and making sure that we're cognizant of it through all of our hiring decisions and the way we approach the marketplace. And I believe that we've done a good job of shining a spotlight on the fact that in the asset management industry, it's not as inclusive as it should be. Actually, the numbers are stark. And we need to do a better job of having our asset management industry reflect the diversity in our society.
You sort of mentioned this obliquely just a moment ago. Is it equally important for the leadership of the SEC, whoever it is, to also reflect America more broadly?
Look, I think these types of things, you have to have them in your mind as you're making decisions. No one who's been in a diverse boardroom or a diverse decision-making body comes away with it without understanding that it adds, it enhances decision-making. It makes for better decisions. And so, of course, anybody who's forming that kind of body wants a diversity of experience and perspective.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to save the toughest one for last, I suspect, and that's money market fund reform, because we've heard a lot about short-term funding. There's been various attempts to try to address it. We had it as a crisis, really, I think it's fair to say, this spring again, where the Fed had to step in. We don't seem to have our arms around it. I talked with Dan Tarullo, a former Fed member, recently, and he said he thinks it's up to the SEC in the next round to do that. What could be done on the short-term funding front?
Well, as usual, you framed this in the right way, which is, the short-term funding markets and the money markets are inextricably linked. The short-term funding markets are different depending on the underlying instrument. So our treasury market, and there are money market treasury funds, is far different from the short-term municipal paper market, which also has money market funds. And what we need to do, David, is we need to recognize those differences across short-term funding, treasuries, agencies, commercial paper, muni paper, and that to put together a near cash product or a cash type product in each one of those sectors is quite a different thing. So I expect that reforms will reflect those differences. I expect reforms will be coming. I also expect that those reforms will not only be the result of domestic consultation led by the SEC, the Fed, and the others, but also international consultation. Because what we did find out, again, in the spring of this year, is that short-term funding markets are interconnected, not just domestically, but internationally.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much. It's always been a pleasure talking to you. We look forward to talking to you when you're a civilian again. That is Jay Clayton. He's chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Coming up, Balance and Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk to James Lewis of CSIS. In the meantime, we want to go to Abigail Doolittle right now for more on that Doordash IPO. Abigail, so it's out and it's priced at $182, is that right?
That is correct. This is really pretty incredible, David. This stock, from where the IPO priced at 102, is now up about 80% over the last couple of minutes since it did open at $182 per share. As you mentioned, I've seen it as high as $195. I saw it lower. Right now, right around that level. So it's going to be very interesting to see where this stock actually closes on the day. But huge demand. The IPO frenzy of 2020 continues. This company right now has a valuation, a market cap of about $60 billion right out of the gate. Of course, they are the largest food delivery service here in the United States, really a beneficiary of the pandemic as folks are stuck at home ordering food in. But this stock is just amazing. And talk about the big winners from the earlier investors, Sequoia, Kleiner Perkins back in 2016. We also have SoftBank, one of the biggest holders, their position from 2018, and then even Cotu more recently. So lots of big gains here for DoorDash, and right now hugging that opening price of $182. It's going to be great to watch this all day, David, and see where it does in fact close out.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. No question about it. Thanks so much to Abigail Doolittle. Now we want to bring in Emily Chang. She is, of course, the anchor of Bloomberg Technology, and she had a big interview with the founder of DoorDash just earlier today. Emily, give us what your perspective on how we're doing.
David, well, Abigail used the word incredible. I might also add the word insane. This is a company that raised at a $16 billion valuation just 6 months ago. Of course, they've seen huge growth in the pandemic, but even the company itself says growth will likely slow down as we get to a new normal, as a vaccine gets on the way. I did sit down with Tony Xu. He founded this company just 7 years ago. I said, how does this feel? You're looking at a potentially $40+ billion company, maybe $60 or $70 billion at the end of the day. He said it is surreal. He also said this. Take a listen.
It really is a testament to the hard work of all of the people inside the walls at DoorDash, as well as the partnership with our ecosystem, our merchants, the dashers on our platform, everyone outside of our four walls for the past 7 years, as well as a reflection of the confidence that investors have about our future.
Now, DoorDash does own 50% of the food delivery market, but there is rapidly evolving competition, consolidating competition, Uber buying Postmates, Just Eat buying Grub. So there are bigger and bigger players out there. What is really interesting here, David, is what this means for Airbnb tomorrow. First of all, DoorDash could end up being a bigger company than Airbnb by market cap at the end of the day, but it shows that the appetite for tech stocks is out there, and some of the folks who lost out on DoorDash today might be piling in to Airbnb tomorrow.
And I'm so glad you raised the question about the market share. I mean, full disclosure here, we use DoorDash. I know how to use it. I know how to find it, no question. But they have 50% of the market share. What's the moat around their company? Why can't somebody else come along? Because there are alternative services already. Why can't they come and take away that market share?
Absolutely. Well, I did ask that question to Tony Xu, and he talked about their superior product. Look, DoorDash got to the suburbs early. They colonized the suburbs early, and they really own those parts of the country. Uber was much later to the game. Grub was early, but their product, I think some would say, is not necessarily superior. The big question for DoorDash is going forward, costs. They do spend a lot on marketing. They're trying to reach you, David. They're offering promotions all the time to make sure you're staying with that service, because some folks could say this is just a commodity. You're just going to go where the service fee is the lowest. And so DoorDash is going to have to continue to work to maintain and increase that market share over time.
Okay, thank you so much for Emily Chang. Great reporting. I loved that interview. I watched it as you were doing it. We want to turn now to Bloomberg's Sonali Basak for more on DoorDash. And Sonali, I want to ask already, do some second guessing here. It's opened so far above where it priced. Are people going to raise some questions about the pricing?
Of course, Silicon Valley always does when the IPO price is so high, and the bankers really did take pains here to make sure that they were as close to the market value as they could get. But with that said, this is a soaring IPO. DoorDash, even before this major pop in its price, had been the most expensive gig economy company already by its price to sales multiple. And you look at the market value now, and it's resounding, because at $70 billion, as Emily says, by the end of the day, you have Uber over at $97 billion in market value. You're getting very close to each other. So again, you have bankers, of course, that by any means would be excited about this deal, despite even this IPO pop. It was not the biggest IPO pop we saw this year, even with such a big rise in the stock, David.
But still, it's a good day for Goldman and for JP Morgan in particular. One more question. Emily Chang raised it. What does this mean, do we think, for Airbnb?
So for Airbnb, you'll look at the bankers tonight, see if they can get a little more price out of this deal. Airbnb is not the same story as DoorDash, as we know, but with that said, they've had a lot of faith in the company from Wall Street. We've seen Owl Rock, Apollo, big companies really come to the company's backing this year, and you can expect that type of investor behavior to follow through. But remember, this rise in valuation at Airbnb, we're not seeing soar as high as we're seeing the NASDAQ soar, whereas DoorDash, we've seen really benefit from this pandemic.
Okay, thank you so very much, Sonali Basak, and to Emily Chang and to Abigail Doolittle for bringing us the story of the DoorDash beginning to trade at 182 in the end. It was priced originally, remember, at 102, making it over $40 billion in market cap. Pretty extraordinary for something that will deliver all your food to you at home. Coming up on Bloomberg, we're going to have a second hour of Balance of Power over on radio, and we will be talking about DoorDash and what it's doing to the marketplace, among other things. That does it for Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.